It began the morning after the funeral, when the house still smelled faintly of flowers and food brought by neighbors, though most of it had gone cold and stale. The family gathered in the living room, a place that had seen countless holidays, arguments, and reconciliations. Now it felt different, hushed, strained, like the walls themselves knew something heavy hung in the air. Their father had left behind more than memories. He had left behind a house, land, and enough wealth to keep his children comfortable, provided they could decide who deserved what. That was the problem. James, the eldest, sat stiffly in his father's favorite chair, his face hard with the authority he had always assumed came naturally with being firstborn. Sarah, younger and quick-tempered, leaned against the arm of the sofa with folded arms, her eyes flashing with suspicion before anyone even spoke. Daniel, the youngest, carried an anxious smile that looked more like a shield than an expression, trying to soften the atmosphere with words no one wanted to hear. Dad wouldn't want us to fight. But fights had a way of finding families in moments like this. At first, everything seemed straightforward. The will was supposed to be clear, the estate divided equally, no one left behind. That's what their father had promised in life, repeating it often enough that each child believed it like a commandment carved in stone. But when the envelope was opened, when the lawyer read the neat black lines on white paper, silence fell across the room. The words had been changed. Instead of 3 equal parts, nearly everything, house, land, savings, was left to James. Sarah and Daniel were named, yes, but with scraps, gestures more symbolic than substantial. The lawyer's voice droned on, but the shock pressed like iron against Sarah's chest. She glanced at James, and in that moment, his stillness told her everything. He wasn't surprised. He knew. Maybe he had known for weeks, maybe months. Daniel blinked rapidly, his smile gone, his fingers clenching his knees as if he might hold himself together with sheer will. When the lawyer left, leaving behind papers and stunned silence, Sarah found her voice first. She demanded answers, sharp words that cut through the quiet, like glass shattering. How could their father have changed his will? When had he done it? And more importantly, why? James listened calm, too calm, then explained with the kind of logic that sounded practiced. Father had simply decided. Father wanted the estate preserved in one piece, not carved up. Father believed James was the one capable of managing it. Sarah didn't buy a word. Neither did Daniel, though his protests were softer, uncertain. But the truth crept in, slow and bitter. James had been living closest to their father. James had handled his appointments, his medicines, his papers. James had access. It wouldn't take much to influence an aging man whose hands shook when signing documents, whose mind wandered in the evenings. The system was easy to cheat if you were clever enough, patient enough, and cold enough. The weeks that followed were filled with phone calls, meetings, and whispered arguments that spilled into public shouting matches. Sarah pressed to contest the will, hiring a lawyer who spoke of undue influence and suspicious signatures. Daniel hesitated, caught between loyalty to his siblings and the fear of tearing apart what little family they had left. James stood his ground, stone-faced, never wavering, repeating the same line. This is what Father wanted. But in the quiet moments, Sarah remembered her father's words, how he had once held her hand and told her he wanted everything fair. She remembered him saying it to Daniel, too, smiling in that weary but warm way he had. It wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about the sense that no matter what, they would all stand equal in their father's eyes. Now that trust lay shattered. The case dragged on. Documents were examined, signatures compared, testimonies gathered. Secret surfaced, too, about meetings James had arranged, about the notary who claimed the old man seemed confused, about how conveniently the changes had been made only weeks before their father's final illness. Every revelation deepened the divide. Where once there had been siblings, now there were adversaries. In the end, the court ruled in James's favor. The will stood, the estate remained his, and Sarah and Daniel were left with almost nothing. The judgment was final, but the wound it left was far from closed. Sarah refused to speak to James again. Daniel tried for a time, But the conversations were strained, polite on the surface and poison beneath. The house, once filled with the echoes of shared laughter, grew quiet under James's ownership. He lived there alone, surrounded by walls heavy with memories that no longer felt like his to keep. Sarah built her life elsewhere, her bitterness hardening into silence. Daniel drifted between them, though eventually, even he gave up trying to mend what had been broken. The inheritance had been won, yes, but the family had been lost. And in the hollow silence of that old house, James came to understand what he had truly inherited. Not wealth, not land, but the emptiness of a name that no longer meant family. James had always been the serious one. Even as a boy, he assumed authority no one had given him. He watched their father carefully, imitated the way he folded his arms, the way he spoke with finality. Sarah, on the other hand, was restless, outspoken, never afraid to argue. Their father would sometimes laugh at her stubbornness, saying she had his fire, though he softened the words with a smile. Daniel, the youngest by several years, lived in their shadows, quiet and eager to please, the one who always ran to fetch things or smoothed over quarrels with a clumsy joke. Their father's lessons were always the same: fairness, hard work, loyalty. He wasn't a rich man by birth. He had built the estate piece by piece, saving and sacrificing until it stood not just as land and a house, but as proof of his labor. "This will be yours, all of yours," he'd tell them at the dinner table, his voice rough but proud. Equally. No fighting. No one above the other. It was a promise Sarah clung to like a truth carved into the bones of their family. But as their father grew older, things began to shift. His health declined, his thoughts grew hazy, and slowly, inevitably, James took the reins. At first, it made sense. He lived closest, he knew the farm, he handled bills and paperwork. But Sarah noticed the way he spoke on their father's behalf more and more, how he dismissed her suggestions with a patronizing wave. Daniel, caught between, excused it as necessity, though doubt flickered in his eyes when he thought no one noticed. When the will was revealed, Sarah wasn't just angry. She was betrayed. Betrayed not only by James, but by the ghost of her father, who seemed to have broken the very vow that defined him. She couldn't reconcile it. It was easier to believe James had twisted the truth, nudged their father at his weakest, taken advantage of those trembling hands and foggy evenings. Easier to believe a sibling had cheated the system than to accept their father had changed his heart. The feud consumed them. Courtrooms became their battlegrounds, but the real war lived in their hearts. Old grievances resurfaced. James accusing Sarah of being reckless, Sarah accusing James of being controlling, Daniel accused of cowardice for never choosing a side. Every bitter word widened the chasm. There were nights Sarah lay awake, remembering Christmas mornings when they'd sat cross-legged on the same rug, tearing into presents, laughing until their stomachs hurt. She tried to summon that brother, the one who had once built her a treehouse, who had defended her on the schoolyard. But when she saw James now, she saw only the man who sat smugly in their father's chair as the lawyer read out the will. Daniel, too, was haunted. He wanted peace, longed for it, but every time he looked at James, the unspoken truth pressed down on him. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe James had manipulated everything. Still, he couldn't bring himself to sever ties, not completely. He visited James once in a while, sat in the old living room, drank a beer in silence, the ghost of their father between them. It was never comfortable. James, for all his victory, found little satisfaction. The estate was his, yes. The land stretched out under his control. The money sat in his accounts. But the silence was unbearable. He walked the halls alone, his footsteps echoing in rooms that once rang with siblings' voices. At night, when the wind moved through the trees outside, he swore he could hear his father's voice, not words but a kind of heaviness, disappointment lingering in the air. He told himself he had done nothing wrong, that he had only secured what needed to be secured. Yet he could not shake the sense that in winning, he had lost something larger, something that could never be restored. Years passed, but the wound did not close. Sarah raised her own family with a kind of fierce independence. determined never to let greed or betrayal touch her children. Daniel drifted into a quieter life, keeping his distance from both siblings, nursing regrets he rarely spoke aloud. And James, though wealthier than either, carried the bitterest inheritance of all, a legacy poisoned by mistrust, a home stripped of warmth, and the knowledge that when he finally left the world, no one would gather in his living room to mourn him as a brother. The feud had begun with papers and signatures, but it ended in silence, a silence heavier than death itself.